Our gospel story today comes from the 15th chapter of Luke's gospel, and I like to think of this chapter of Luke as the story of lost things. We have a lost sheep and a lost coin today, and the other part of that gospel is the story, probably the most famous part of it, the lost son or the prodigal son, and that story we looked at back in Lent. So we have the lost sheep and the lost coin today. Three parables of joy in this chapter of Luke about lost things. And I have two questions in my mind to share with you today, having read that gospel. Who does God love? And what is God like? Who does God love? And what is God like? First, let's think about the context of this story. Jesus in chapter 14 has painted a wonderful picture of the great banquet of heaven, where all are invited. And it's one of those instances in Luke's gospel, as in the other gospels, where eating is important. I like that part. Eating is important. Jesus felt that table fellowship was important. And I'm always looking for opportunities to eat together. And we had banana bread and cinnamon rolls at the adult forum this morning. You know, most of you missed it. I'm sorry. But we're sharing. There'll be some left over for coffee hour. And on Wednesday, we're joining together for the first of the Eat, Learn, Pray sessions. And of course, that starts with eating, very important. So very biblical to be sharing food together. But the Pharisees and the scribes don't think this is a good idea. They're grumbling. They don't like the people that Jesus chooses to eat with, tax collectors and sinners. And it's not the first time they're grumbling. They grumbled when Jesus ate with Zacchaeus, the tax collector. They grumbled when the uninvited woman came to dinner and anointed Jesus' feet. Because tax collectors and sinners in the eyes of the Pharisees and scribes were not good. And God loves those who are good in the eyes of the Pharisees and scribes, and perhaps in the eyes of any number of other people since them. Who is good in the eyes of God? Who does God love? As I was preparing this sermon, I came across an article originally in the Catholic Digest. There's a woman who writes for them called Dr. Kathleen Chesto. She's described as a parent educator. And she, when she was writing this, had a 5-year-old child who asked this question. Is God like a grown-up or like a parent? Is God like a grown-up or like a parent? She may be Dr. Kathleen, and she may be a parent educator, but she was perplexed by this question. So she said, well, can you explain what you mean by, what's the difference between God being like a grown-up and God being like a parent? And the response of the child was that, well, grown-ups like you and love you if you're good. Parents just love you. Okay. Who does God love? Is God like a grown-up or like that marvelous parent? It's a similar way of asking the question is like, who is in and who is out? Last week, if you were here, the children sang a song which said, God loves everyone he's made. And that means that God loves those who sometimes aren't what we would call good, who don't really make the grade on that score. And we have two of those people in other parts of our readings, in our psalm and in our reading from 1 Timothy. King David, Psalm 51 is his lament of a time when he was not good. He'd committed adultery, he'd committed murder, but he was sorry and repented and continued to live in a relationship with God despite those not good moments. St. Paul, writing to Timothy, talks about having been a blasphemer, a persecutor, and a man of violence, but someone who, having had a period of not being good, received mercy. Paul, David, us from time to time, still loved by God even when we aren't good. And my other question, what is God like? The stories of the lost sheep and the lost coin are interested. The shepherd and the woman in the stories represent God. And that is so Luke. If there were two, in addition to tax collectors and sinners, if there were two groups of people who did not figure very well in that era, it would have been shepherds and women. And for Luke to choose a shepherd and a woman to depict what God was like was a very Luke kind of thing to do. These stories present God as a persistent seeker and one who rejoices when that which was lost has been found. It's time for eating, yay, and celebrating. And the same is true in that other lost story from Luke 15, the story of the prodigal son, a big party to celebrate. And I would suggest that there are for each of us moments, or perhaps for some even more than moments, of being lost. Perhaps you've been physically lost in the woods. I was once lost with a group of college friends on the south side of Chicago, quite late at night. It was not a good feeling. Luckily, we found where we were and got where we were going, but it was not good to be lost in the dark. But we may be physically in a known place and yet still lost. Could be lost as a result of change in circumstances of many kinds, a job loss, a bereavement, a change in health for ourselves or someone we love. Choices that we make, like David. Many things can cause us to be lost. And I know when I'm lost, and I've been lost and found more than once, I sometimes need to place myself in places to be found. And this is what I mean. I want to pick up on something Rob said last week, that there's a great benefit in exploring the inner life. Because in doing so, we can be found afresh, or indeed for the first time by God. To have that knowledge that God loves us, like that small child's idea of parent love, unconditional love. We don't have to be good for God to love us, because there's nothing we can do to make God love us more, and there's nothing we can do to make God love us less, because God just loves us unconditionally. And sometimes that is really hard to realize on your own. The way we've been brought up can affect that. Lots of things can affect that. The world we live in, we were talking about that this morning at Adult Forum, the world we live in sends lots of messages about how we're not good enough. We are good enough for God. But for me, it's been really important to have both a prayer partner and a spiritual director. And yesterday was a really fantastic day. I went to Hopkinton, New Hampshire. I'd never been to Hopkinton, New Hampshire before. It's a lovely place. And there was a diocesan gathering to talk about the spiritual life and health of the diocese and those in it, and to begin to plan for the future, to give those in the diocese who are looking for, perhaps a better word for a spiritual director, is a soul friend, a companion for the journey. People who are looking for that, or perhaps even feel that God's calling them into that sort of a ministry. How are we going to make that happen in this place? Because I do believe that God seeks and finds the lost in any numbers of ways. So no matter what we've done or left undone, David and Paul again, I know, at least for myself, that I need to intentionally show up to keep being found when I feel lost. And when I show up, I discover that God is already there, waiting for me and looking for me. What is God like? Well, I invite you to look at Jesus. He called himself the Good Shepherd. He said in John's Gospel, "I am the Good Shepherd." And there's an old hymn that reminds us of the story of our faith, of our Christian faith. "You did not wait for me to come near to you, but clothed yourself in frail humanity. God put on flesh and came to dwell among us that we might know that love of God." So I invite you to find those times and places where you can be quiet, where you can be still, and discover, maybe for the first time, that God loves you. You don't have to be good. You just have to be. So I invite you to find those times and places and to let God work in and through you. Amen.